Hi, everybody, and welcome to Plural Acceptance Week, and it's Traumagenic Tuesday. And so, what is traumagenic? Basically, it means that your plural system was developed in some way in the presence of trauma, and that there's a fairly high correlation between trauma history and plurality, but it's not a requirement.
So many DID and ISSTD systems identify as traumagenic, but doesn't necessarily mean that they identify if they choose not to. So, for example, on that one, you may be an endogenic system and you were endogenic before, and then you experience trauma, but that doesn't necessarily make you a traumagenic system. You could still be an endogenic system if you chose to be, but you are also quite able to be a traumagenic system if you'd like to identify as that. It's all about how you'd like to identify. Trauma doesn't necessarily mean you're a traumagenic system. Anybody else want to talk?
I was going to say, I don't want to name them because I don't know if it's appropriate to do so. Probably not. But I do know a system that identifies as endogenic but has DID. So it's like there's like traumagenic doesn't mean DID. That's kind of a big misconception that goes around.
Yep.
So yeah.
And there's also, I believe somebody at the conference identifies as endogenic, but once could have qualified for a DID diagnosis as well. So you can life changes and how you identify changes. So you can identify as whatever you feel you need to identify at any time.
Yeah, we're quadgenic, but we could actually meet the requirements for DID if we needed help for that, but we don't. So there's really no point in seeking a diagnosis or having that being an identifying, like an important identifying part of us. So for us, it's kind of like we could technically meet the criteria, but it wouldn't change anything. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I think people who do have DID that is trauma based, eventually they might heal that trauma and then they might want to identify different. And they can.
In terms of diagnoses, you can qualify for a diagnosis for years, and then something changes and you no longer qualify for the diagnosis, but you're still plural regardless.
The other point I was going to add to that was if you add the dissociative aspect, there can be systems who don't actually remember their trauma, but they're still a multiple. It's been systems that discover their trauma in their 30s, their 40s, up to their 70s and 80s. But there's also systems that never remember that they had trauma, but they're still multiple. It's still a part of the plural umbrella. Like, as I said, it's system identification. Whatever you want to identify as, that's how you are identified as.
And we will talk about endogenic and other non-trauma stuff another day. Today's Traumagenic Tuesday, so we're going to keep talking about trauma stuff. So,
you guys want to talk about common issues when interacting with traumatized people?
Sure. So go ahead.
Go.
I was going to say that there are things that can trigger people that that we might be best off being careful about in our community and when dealing with people to be trauma sensitive, to be trauma informed. So there are possible trigger words, yelling at people, raising your voice can affect people and be traumatizing. So there are a lot of communities that are more careful about what words are able to be said within their community because they are, let's say, more likely to be triggering.
Yeah, so things like religious mentions, stories, holidays, and characters.
Yep.
I would put up talking about rape or sex jokes, especially when they're involving family members. Putting like throwaway comments like, in the same way that people use, oh, that's so gay, it's like, how's your mum after last night? Like, those kind of jokes that aren't funny, but are actually very triggering.
So things within communities that are also triggering or problematic are dismissing other people's experiences, like whether it's that's not traumatic, or that happened to me and it didn't bother me, or just not believing people when they say something. Dismissing them on any level can be very traumatizing and triggering for people.
Yeah.
So having multiple personalities or split personalities and using that in jest, like saying, oh, that wasn't me, that was blah, blah, blah. I don't know what you're talking about. And almost as if pretending to have multiple personalities.
Yeah,
So,
or making it like a joke,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we get a lot of that from the media, portraying that we can just switch, and that it's we also get the stereotype that we all have a murderous alter. There have been systems who have outed themselves, and yet when they go to somebody's house, the person asks them, oh, which of my family members are you going to murder? So it's a very in your face, and it's not okay. It's not okay.
So the overall statistics of crime victims and so on show that people who are victims are usually re-victimized, and not the people who create victims. As a general rule, it's very unusual for the early childhood trauma victims and such to be perpetrators, so much as being the victims of additional trauma, because basically when we run around defensive, perpetrators notice and choose us as victims because they know we have broken boundaries and such.
Yeah.
The other thing, I kind of want to point this out because commonly a lot of the stereotypes around that idea that people who have been through trauma will traumatize other people and abuse other people is largely around the topic of CSA. So, like, whenever I've seen it mentioned that trauma victims reenact their own trauma onto more victims, it's often discussed in that way, particularly around CSA, like child sexual abuse, in regards to, like pedophilia especially. Like that's the topic that pretty much always comes up.
Right, but not normally everyone with DID, traumagenic or not, is a pedophile or abuses their kids, right?
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to say is it's like there's that stereotype, but it's not true, because it's more often that the people who have been victimized are more often a continuing victim. They're re-victimized,
Right.
like you said. So it's like, I just thought I'd point that out because it's a common stereotype kind of thing.
Yeah, it was the first thing my family told me when I got diagnosed with DID, actually. So it hits close to home because obviously I don't abuse my children in any way, and so it was very offensive.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to talking about weighing traumas and other people asking or digging into other people's traumas?
Sure.
Very common in trauma community is saying, my trauma wasn't as bad as your trauma, so maybe I shouldn't be the way that I am because I wasn't as bad. But the thing is trauma, and everybody will experience it differently and react differently. There's not actually a right way to deal with trauma. It's just how your body reacts, and it's not a choice. So to experience trauma is never a choice that anyone would choose for themselves. It's just simply how our body reacts. To weigh trauma is not helpful for trying to deal with that trauma when you are constantly making it less than what it is. If it was traumatic for you, then it's trauma.
The other factor that I think is kind of relevant to that is, and I don't have sources for this, but it's quite interesting, is that trauma is often, it occurs after an event has happened to someone, but after the event happens, they don't receive any comfort or any sort of coping for that or ways to talk about that. And so it gets worse, and it becomes a trauma because it doesn't heal, because they never get past it. So it's like,
yeah, it can be more traumatic afterwards than the actual event if you don't have support or you don't have people believing you. That then becomes more traumatic.
It also greatly increases the chance to create DID or to have DID from early childhood trauma if there's no support afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also sometimes the expectation that people can deal with trauma in a certain way, and if you don't fit into that box, then you don't get the sympathy or you don't get any help, really, because, you know, two people can go through the exact same trauma and one person may be fine and not have any consequences of that, and another person might get PTSD or develop DID. It's roll of the dice, really. It's not in our control.
I like
Right.
what you said about it being part of our body, because they're finding more and more evidence that the trauma actually does change the neurology and the hormone system and so on of the body. So there's a lot of more recent research on the brain and the biology portions of the trauma, of DID and so on, that continually proves that it's a scar or a change, like a fundamental change in our actual physical system. So this is definitely not something we thought our way into, and it's a process after the trauma hits, after the painful experience happens, and like you said, there's a period of time in which it can be processed properly with additional support, whatever, or maybe people are more resilient and can go through that process. And other people don't have whatever it is that they need, the resources they need to process it properly. And that's when it starts escalating into PTSD.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking like deeply on the neurological level, you're talking about that fight or flight response, and it's actually blown out to fight, flight, flee, fawn, and faint. So it has developed, but it's that reaction of our autonomic nervous system and whether we can calm down with our parasympathetic nervous system. So it's talking about hormones, it's talking about how we can recover from trauma, and that goes down to a atomic level.
Yes.
Yeah, and we also know that you only have to experience that once for permanent change in your brain. So that's also a very good reason why it's not needed to trauma away, because the initial damage was already done.
Definitely.
Right. So even saying, well, it only happened once is already weighing in some ways, because it does damage to you, period. It's not a matter of my damage is more or less or anything like that. You're damaged. You've been how do they put it? It's like brain damage. It's a wound that is inflicted on you. So it's kind of a traumatic brain injury in some ways when you've been traumatized. So whether it's a one-day thing like the 9/11 tragedy in New York, or it's an ongoing thing like a refugee seeking asylum, it's still trauma. You still come out of that with the nightmares and the flashbacks and the somatic issues and so on.
Yeah, and talking on the somatic issues, that's that huge comorbidity that we have in the trauma community with people who have lung conditions, or they have what am I trying to say? Other mental illnesses because of the trauma and being in trauma time for so long. The body has adapted to that, and it has taken its toll on the body. And so there's such high comorbidities and so many things for those who have like DID and OSDD.
Okay, so some of the other things about like not digging into other people's trauma when they're not ready, or asking for proof from people, that can be really offensive. Even trying to get them to talk about it before they're ready can be re-traumatizing. You were about to say?
I was going to say, how do you prove something that happened years ago? Unless an abuser comes forward and says, yes, I did that, you don't have any physical proof apart from what's going on in your head. So that's why it's really important. I mean, the DSM has now said you can report your own alters, so it's a step in the right direction.
Yes, I wanted to add on that need for proof is not only about trauma, but also about diagnoses. Or not even diagnoses. If someone says they're plural, the DSM-5 says we have the right to self-report. If we can do that with psychologists and psychiatrists, we should also be able to do it within our own communities.
So another thing that's common within the traumagenic community is memory issues. So sometimes we may know, quote unquote, that something happened to us because we have the somatic proof or we have the triggers, but we may not have the memory of what exactly happened. So we may know something happened viscerally and in our body and stuff without actually having memories. So since people with trauma may be interested in therapy, we have some videos linked in the description below for help for people who are looking for therapists and things to interview therapists and so on, things on finding a good therapist. Another resource for people is that there's a hashtag DID chat on Twitter on Tuesdays. So today's Traumagenic Tuesday. Everybody is welcome in the chat. So you do not have to be a traumagenic system. They often have topics that are endogenic and other plural friendly. So it's always worth checking out DID chat on Tuesdays. I believe it's at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Twitter, but the questions they have will be up anyway, and you can just answer the questions anytime.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys and gals, and however you identify. Please cut me. Just cut me.
Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you have a great acceptance week, and we hope to see you Saturday for Plural Pride Day.
And don't forget to click subscribe and the bell for notifications. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.